Mr. Reardon, I want to ask you, what are the major barriers we have to hiring additional CBP personnel?
Thank you, Senator. I forgot to unmute myself. I think probably the one of the main barriers is that I've said for years and years that the current CBP officers, and this actually even goes beyond just the officers to other employees. I think CBP employees should be the best recruiters for the agency. And unfortunately, the morale for many years has been very low. And some of that relates back to what you've heard me talking about in my opening statements, in my written statement about staffing. There are so few staffs, so much fewer than are needed. And as a result, many employees have to work a great deal of overtime, and it impacts their personal well-being. It impacts their families, and creates real hardships on them. So, and as a result, the morale's low, and they are not the best recruiters. I think we have started to see CBP has done a much better job of actually going out and recruiting folks and starting to bring them in. And certainly there's been some funding that has assisted in that process from Congress. So we thank you obviously for that. But from my perspective, and I think this question probably is really well suited for CBP, but I think from my perspective, if we can start finding a way to really improve the morale, get more staffing in there, we're going to start seeing some real improvement.
Were you surprised at President Biden's budget flatlined all of DHS and flatlined hiring, that it did not extend new hiring in CBP?
Well, what I will say, and I think I said in my longer statement, is that we believe that more staffing is needed, and I certainly hope that Congress will provide more money to CBP, more funding to CBP. I think the last thing that is needed is a situation where we have to look at furloughs for employees, especially at a time where we're looking, Senator, at the economy rebounding and travel is going to start really increasing. That would be a problem. The TDYs that CBP employees are having to endure, and they've had to do it now for several years, and it's happening again right now, and it will only increase, I believe, in the summer. Those have a very significantly negative impact on the folks that are not only having to travel down to do the TDY, but also they're leaving a port of entry, and that has a negative impact on the staffing in that port as well.
Right, I would assume so for that significantly. Thank you for that. Mr. McAlean, I need to ask you a little bit about what we've talked about several times, and that's about hard narcotics coming into the United States. I'm in Oklahoma. Unlike Arizona, I'm not a border state, but what happens at the border certainly affects us. We have the flow of narcotics that are coming into our state as well. And as you mentioned already, just fentanyl has increased by 3 times just over the last year. So while COVID time, we've seen a decrease in a lot of movement, the exception to that has been fentanyl coming into the country and being interdicted. We've seen a dramatic increase in that. You talked a lot about additional technology and getting to the point where we can do 100% non-intrusive evaluations of the border of vehicles and pedestrians. What kind of time period and what is needed to be able to achieve that? Does the technology exist, or do you need additional new technology, just additional deployment of that?
Can I give you 30 seconds on your last question as well?
Sure.
So just really quickly, I agree with Tony's points on supporting the workforce and increasing morale. But CBP's actually done quite a bit with the workload staffing model, with recruiting, with shortening the time to hire by 70%. What I think is needed next is really a replacement of the fee basis for hiring, which is 1/3 of CBP officers, with more of a TSA style. Fees can reimburse hiring, but we need a consistent appropriation from Congress that meets the workload staffing model, so you can keep that supply chain of officers, that recruiting process going without disruption. So that'd be my structural recommendation on the hiring. And they will need some support from Congress coming out of COVID. In terms of does this technology exist now to really make substantial gains on interdiction of hard narcotics at the ports of entry? Yes, it does. The deployments of the multi-energy portals of the low energy portals for the personally owned vehicle lanes are already making an impact and increasing the numbers of inspection. And as you heard Tony mention, the fentanyl seizures up 300%. The technology exists. They've got key players on contract to go ahead and keep deploying those systems now. What we need to do is look at what the investments needed and what makes the most sense to get that as close as possible to 100% at the land border, and then to look at the outbound piece. I will note that the border is a chain, and a chain is as strong as its weakest link. You will have security spillover issues between ports of entry. As you're already seeing, opportunistic smugglers go between ports right now with hard narcotics, which was not happening as much in the past. The majority went through the ports of entry. So that'll be something Congress has to look at holistically.
Obviously, to be able to make changes in technology, you're adding additional items, additional inspection points and such. That's harder to do at some of the older ports of entry that are more landlocked and that are in urban areas. Easier to do in open rural areas. So let me do twofold here. One is that we have a real difference in how the land ports of entries are overseeing the physical areas. Some of those GSA oversees, in fact, most of those do. Some of those CBP actually runs their own in more rural areas, especially along the Canadian border. How do we resolve this? Because when I talk to folks at CBP, I often hear the issue of, I'd like to make changes, but it's 7 years to be able to make a change when we go through GSA and all sorts of edits, and it takes forever to be able to get there. How do we fix that process so obvious problems on the ground can get fixed and CBP can actually not only just make the request, but actually get it executed?
Great question. It's an extraordinarily complex bureaucratic process, both on the U.S. government side, at the federal level, working with state locals, and with that critical binational coordination with Mexico. Two things that I've seen have worked is a joint prioritization between CBP and GSA of which ports of entry require investment and improvement at the national level annually. That's important. Doing the same with Mexico, equally important. But I do think we need to shorten the number of steps needed to make a significant infrastructure change. The process of a presidential permit with the Department of State is another cumbersome layer, an appropriate review. But all these things, I think, should face tighter timelines and more of a teamwork and coordinated effort to get done. In terms of the day-to-day management of ports of entry at the border, that's another challenge. We have a mixed real estate oversight. CBP owns a significant number of the smaller ports of entry, especially those funded in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, while GSA leases back to CBP and manages some of the larger ports of entry that have the majority of traffic on the southwest border. That creates a cumbersome process for prioritizing fixes and improvements, and I think can be done better, honestly, at the federal, national level, but also at the regional and local level.
I would agree it could be done better. I do see the layers of bureaucracy and the challenges that are there. That CBP has got to set their priorities. They go through their own studies, set priorities. Then it goes to GSA. They go through years of study on a second set of priorities. Then it's got to get with State Department. And it's got to get with the White House with OMB. That's years in process just to be able to study and evaluate what is obvious needs to be done. And you typically say it needs to be done when it needs to be done, not 7 years in advance of when it needs to be done. So we've got to find a way to be able to get that resolved, and that's one of the things our subcommittee is working on right now. So any insight that we can get, I'd be glad to be able to get. And I see I've run a little bit over time on that. I yield back. Thank you again. Let me run through a series of questions here, and this is going to be more specifically for Kevin and Mr. Reardon. I'll be able to go back and forth through. This is a challenge. It's not normal, but it is a challenge for us to be able to try to process through. So January of this year, Department of Justice announced that they were sentencing a CBP individual, and I'll leave his name out, for 30 months to prison for bribery after he received a $6,000 cash bribe to allow a convicted felon through the Nogales port of entry. Not typical, does happen at times. My question is, what are we doing to be able to continue to accelerate this? Obviously, the cartels have a tremendous amount of cash. They're moving that cash around, and they're constantly trying to be able to reach out to be able to find ways to be able to move illicit materials and individuals across our ports. What's the best way to be able to manage that among our employees? Kevin, I'll let you start first.
So I think the most important element is really the investment in the CBP Office of Professional Responsibility. This starts at the hiring and the training with a good background review as someone's coming into the workforce, good periodic reinvestigations, but also having the authority and the resources to follow up on tips that do come in or concerns that are presented. CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility only gained the authority to do their own criminal investigations in 2013. So it's been a developing work in progress. And I think Assistant Commissioner Klein and his team have done a great job in building out a really highly professional workforce. But they've got to combine that effort with the DHS Inspector General and with the FBI Public Corruption Task Forces on the border, their BCTFs, Border Corruption Task Forces, because these are few and far between, but they can be very serious cases. They can expose very serious security risks. And that investment and that oversight and follow through has got to be critical, both for the accountability and security of the American people, but also for Tony's points to the morale of the workforce. They want bad apples and individuals that are violating their oath to be taken out of the workforce. And so having that accountability is really important to the overall health of the organization.
Tony, you want to add anything to that?
I would simply say that Kevin is exactly right in his past life with DHS and CBP. He and I actually had a lot of opportunities to talk about these kinds of things. And one thing I will say about frontline employees, and this extends to their employee representative, in this case NTEU, is that we want employees held accountable as well. It does not do CBP. It does not do employees that are doing the right thing and serving their nation proudly, as the vast majority do. And it certainly doesn't help our country when people are doing what you described was being done by the individual being sentenced to 30 months or whatever it was. So yeah, we think they should be held accountable. And I do want to impress upon everybody on this call, and I think it's already probably well understood, that it is very rare that these kinds of things happen. But when they do, it's important that they are dealt with, in accordance with the law.
I appreciate that very much. And I agree, it is rare, but continuing the process to be able to evaluate, to be able to encourage, maintain morale, and to be able to have professional responsibility would be really important. Flip to the other side of the border, my staff has heard from several different sources that the border crossing cards are occasionally collected, used by cartels, that they will hand them out to drivers that have the physical appearance that's similar to what they're seeing on the card, and try to be able to move individuals and contraband through based on a false border crossing card that doesn't line up with the individual that's actually using it at that moment. What can we do to continue to increase the speed of truck traffic and other traffic coming across, but maintain security? Are there things that we could actually implement or processes in place?
Is that?
Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask if that's for Kevin or for me.
That's a yes. It's for both of you if you have a good thought on that.
So very quickly, the arc of this progress on the border has been really impressive over the last 15 years or so, going from really an oral declaration of citizenship to only 7 accepted documents under the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, going to much more secure documents, going to trusted travelers, programs like Sentry, being able to segment those travelers and have higher confidence in their background. But absolutely more can be done. And I know that CBP is working on incorporating more biometrics and backing up the documents with facial recognition that can be done at speed for pedestrians and those in personally owned vehicles. I think that's a really important augmentation to the security of identity crossing the border.
Anyone have anything to add? Any of the three of you?
And Senator, I would simply add that, whatever the mechanisms are that are put in place, as long as our officers are appropriately trained and how to use whatever the technology is, they will make use of whatever they are instructed to use.
Okay, let me add one more question here. And this is for all 4 of you. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to. If it's redundant, somebody else has already said it. But everyone is very committed to moving through legitimate supplies, materials, good trade across our border, both north and south. The Sentry and FAST programs have been essential for that. But again, if there are problems with Sentry and FAST, we've got to identify those to make sure that that doesn't become an area where we have illicit traffic as well. So it's finding a way to be able to protect those programs, continue to be able to strengthen those programs. Information will be important. The technology around it be important. But any insight that you have to be able to help protect the integrity of those programs to make sure that we can keep it protected and continue to be able to move trade across the border.
Senator, I would say this, that that it is extremely important that you start using the more modern facial technology equipment, because that will help with truck drivers. That helps with all of us 20 years ago might have objected to that. But today we know it's a quicker, faster. I mean, we actually go to airports and pay extra money so they can get our eyeballs on record. So I think that we need to understand that we need to use the most modern technology. The worst thing that can happen to an officer is to be tied to a booth because they don't have enough broadband to be able to move around with tablets and be able to give reports of what they're seeing, what they're observing, and that they don't know who's crossing the border. I mean, that's crazy.
That's very helpful. Anyone else have insight there?
Yeah, and Senator, I'll give you a personal experience that this happened last night at 9 o'clock. I crossed the border into Mexico walking on foot, right? And I came back across and there was minimal line, but there was some people in front of me. And the people that were in front had paper documents and it took forever to get those processed, right? But I came across with my Sentry card, and that has a chip and that has all the biometrics in it. And I just went up to the facial recognition and I was through in 10 seconds. So yes, applying more of that technology would help definitely.
Any other insight? Gentlemen, thank you. I appreciate it very much. Madam Chairman, if I can make one quick personal comment on this. Mr. Valencia is a fan of Ansel Adams photography, which I am as well. Those are magnificent pictures behind you, and he does great photography as well. So thanks for your engagement, and thanks for all your written testimony as well as your oral testimony today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Senator Lankford. And you should see Ansel Adams' work from Arizona. It's phenomenal. And with that, we've reached the end of today's hearing.